There's also Eirik Høyer Leivestad. He's a philosopher, critic, and translator living in Berlin, and he's part of House of Foundation, short Hof or Hof, which is a Norwegian publishing house that sprang from the Møllebyen Literary Festival in Moss 10 years ago. And the press consists of editorial team of artists, novelists, translators, and Eirik has been with the collective since 2016. And there's also Audun Lindholm. He's a critic, author, and publisher. He's been with the pan-Scandinavian magazine Vagant since 2005, I think, and he's the editor-in-chief since 2017. That I lost a decade. That is embarrassing.
That's also because of COVID.
COVID. There's no time. You can't.
Time perception
Time is yeah. Audun is a curator of festivals in Bergen. There's the Auditor Festival, and he's also the editor of volumes on contemporary Norwegian poets such as Stig Sæterbakken. And we will do a small round now of you introducing your publishing projects and the magazines, and then we'll get back to the problem of Berlin. Maybe you want to start, me?
Yes. So Pralin magazine that I work for is an online magazine. It's based mainly in Sweden, but we work with all Scandinavian languages and also texts and contributions in English. It started in, I want to say 2018. Yeah, it's good I have Ida here so she can correct me every time I say something wrong. We had been talking for a long time, also me and Ida, about the situation for literary and art magazines in Sweden. I started on the literary scene about 10 years ago in Sweden and was also an editor for another online magazine at the time. And those online magazines were such important platforms for especially young and not yet established voices and authors and artists. And during those 10 years, I just saw one online magazine after another just shutting down, and we lost all those important spaces for, people like me, for example, who I don't come from like a background where I had access to like the literary or cultural world at all. So those online magazines were really just like a launching, launching pad. A little wild today. So we really missed this, and we said, okay, but let's do something about it. And Ida initiated it, and I feel that we have been successful in this also, that we have really become a platform for young, not yet established authors and artists. And we're also interdisciplinary, so we publish both poetry and short stories and visual art and videos and sound art, which is obviously something that you can do in this digital format. And we also publish chapbooks on the side. We published so far 2 anthologies and a poetry book by a Swedish artist that's named Anna Nygren. But our main focus is the online magazine. Yeah.
Thanks, Eirik.
Shall I continue?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, thanks for the invitation. Thank you, Wolfgang, and thank you, Janke, for the keynote. So I will tell you a little bit about House of Foundation. The first thing I can say about House of Foundation is that we are actually quite a crowd. We're a lot of people involved in the projects. And we are quite an eclectic crowd. So I think there are 16 of us in this editorial collective, at least the last time I counted, but I'm not up to speed. Maybe COVID got in the way of something there as well. So we're an eclectic crowd. We have poets, visual artists, designers, philosophers, novelists, and translators. And we don't live in the same place. We are scattered around Europe. I mean, most of us live, or most of the team, they live in Scandinavia, but I live in Berlin, and we also have someone in Paris. And one thing we have in common is actually the place where we congregate, which is called House of Foundation. And House of Foundation is actually a house, a physical building in Moss, which is a small town not so far from Oslo. It's sort of the Norwegian Rust Belt. So you have this old industrial area that has been repurposed into sort of buildings for cultural projects. And House of Foundation is one of them. It's a cultural institution. And we also then have a literary festival every 2 years. And that's basically where we meet, the team. We meet at the literary festival. But we also work together to publish books that revolve around this literary festival. We use the festival as an occasion to commission projects, to produce work, produce books basically, and publish books. So that was how it began 10 years ago. And that's still our main publication or publishing activity still revolves around that, but then we also just started growing and expanding, and we started initiating new projects, and now we are actually publishing quite a lot of books per year, although COVID, again, got in the way of that as well. But we got a lot of new exciting projects coming now in the pipeline. So as I said, we are an eclectic crowd, and sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
You looked at the fortress of books in front of you. Maybe
yes,
you can...
fortress of books. So we do a lot of different things. We are a lot of different people doing a lot of different things. So we do philosophy, poetry. We are subdivided into smaller teams. So we have a team that does contemporary philosophy translations. We have a team that does poetry, and so on. And there is a sort of expanding quality to our whole project, which means that we are expanding thematically. We are expanding in the sense that we actually keep growing as an editorial collective as well. And I think in some ways this is also our approach to publishing. I like this. I'm very fond of this quote from André Breton, the surrealist. He said that we publish to find comrades. And I think that rings true for a lot of our publishing projects, maybe for my co-panelists here as well, that it is also actually a sort of community building in this kind of publishing that we do. It is about finding not only readers, but also building a community, a network of kindred spirits, or a sort of an intellectual and cultural literary community through publication. Maybe I should pass it on to my comrades over here.
Sounds very democratic.
Thank you, Eirik. Yes, it's true that Vagant also publishes to find comrades. So last year we published this book by our comrade Eirik, Høyer Leivestad, to my right. This is our first book, and we're very happy to have published it. But Vagant is mainly a literary journal, started in 1988. This is our newest issue. a thematic issue on the forest. Vagant has always been somewhere, it's neither been a journalistic nor an academic journal, but more essayistic. And we've been sticking to that path ever since, even though the profile of the journal, of course, has changed with the different editors. So, established in Oslo in 1988, moved to Bergen in 1999, and then gradually spreading or becoming more less place-specific, with the editors living in different cities, and sometime around 2008, our designer moved to Berlin. So we started going here to proofread. So the editorial team gathered for a weekend or a week. We proofread the whole day. We went out at night. And gradually it dawned upon us that maybe we could move our main office to Berlin. And so we did. There were economic reasons for that, but of course also cultural reasons. Berlin as a sort of kulturelle Hauptstadt for Germany and Europe is very interesting for a cultural journal. Especially in the Scandinavian countries, the cultural journals have always been kind of channeling impulses, ideas, artistic movements from the continent. Janke mentioned Georg Brandes. He sort of was a missionary for different ideas and literary movements of his time, which he maybe sometimes idealized a little bit and then sort of propagated them in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And cultural journals have ever since been doing a bit of the same kind of work. So translations and introductions have always been very important, so sort of feed new ideas into the cultural milieu in our home countries. For this purpose, Vagant today has a specific project called Vagant Europa, where we translate texts, especially from German journals and feuilleton pages. We also, in this issue, we translated Daniela Danz, the German poet, from her quite new collection Wildnis. But we also, of course, want to participate in discussions wherever we go, such as this event. For some years we had an office in Wedding where we invited to readings and parties. Today we have a much smaller office in Neukölln. We have a tiny balcony where we can meet there. But we are basically working a bit in the same way that Eirik described, living all over the place, having lots of digital communication, sometimes meeting at festivals or events, and sort of following the path wherever it leads us. I have quite a few copies of 2 of our issues, so those who are interested can just approach me and you can have a copy.
Thanks for these brief introductions. I thought it was very interesting that there's this sort of double bind of keeping the ties with the Scandinavian community and at the same time finding, I stick with the term comrade now, that is, I think, is that Berlin specific? Is that something that is specifically possible in Berlin? Because Audun, you also mentioned Berlin also as a pathway to a European discussion. Is that the Berlin specificity here to find? It's a question for the 3 of you, actually.
Well, it has had an impact on my work, the work that I do for the publishing house and also my own writing. And it is exactly this. This is also an interesting thing about this House of Foundation project, that we live in different places. It also means that we are actually immersed in different publics and different communities. And that is also very much reflected in the eclecticism of what we actually publish. And yes, for me, I mean, being in Germany, being part of the German and then also the European, or being connected to the German and European currents, that has a very big influence on my writing, but also the projects that I initiate for House of Foundation.
How is it for you, Mi?
Since I moved here, I have been the only editor from the magazine living here up until now, when Ida also moved here, which is super exciting. But Berlin is definitely, or Germany is definitely a pathway to Europe. So I feel like I have, one foot in the Scandinavian literary scene, and now I'm starting to learn also more about the German literary scene. And I also have from before then like a foot in the American literary scene. And this influences my work a lot, both like Eirik said, as a writer and as an editor, and I take a lot of inspiration from what's happening in other European countries and what's happening in the US. So everything is like a melting pot coming into the magazine. And it will be very exciting also to see what happens now when 2/3 of the Pralin editors are here in Berlin, and we can actually meet physically, because during the whole COVID, we've only been communicating online and we haven't been able to see each other. So it's definitely an exciting time for the magazine, and we even talked about having an issue with the theme of Berlin, for example. Yeah.
Spontaneously thinking now about the question of language, because this panel is in English, and when I lived abroad, I was very happy to be freed of the burden of my own language, not having to speak German. Is that also something that influences your writing or your work, that you, in maybe your everyday life, you speak English or German, and but the language of thinking or writing is still your mother tongue? Is that something productive, or is that, or do you miss speaking Norwegian or Swedish sometimes?
I definitely think it's something productive. I really like the Japanese-German writer Yoko Tawada. She has written some absolutely brilliant essays about this mischung of languages and how you start thinking differently when you all the time encounter a language that is not your own. And in the beginning I was happy to I didn't have to listen to everyone all the time. But as my German proficiency grew, I had to do that here too. But it's basically to switch in between languages all the time it does something with your brain that is I find productive.
It gives you a sort of freedom. I'm thinking of this quote by Thomas Bernhard, who liked to spend so much time in Spain because he said, "I don't understand Spanish, and everything people say sounds like philosophy and poetry to me. I'm freed from the banalities of everyday speech." I always thought that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and you're free from your past in a way. So for me, I feel like I can create a new future now by speaking other languages, which is super interesting. And also, we're multilingual in my family with my husband and me. So, the baby will grow up listening to 4 different languages and speaking 4 different languages. And it's a complete liberation. Very much so, yeah.
I also think it definitely adds something valuable to step outside the culture and the language that you have grown up in, and that you are used to thinking inside. And so it's not only the aspect of not understanding what people around you are saying. Of course, that can be useful, but also actually understanding what people around you are saying in a different language can also be very helpful.
Yes, and I think we have to remember that the Scandinavian countries are pretty insular. Norway is not part of the EU, for instance. That really shapes the debate. And it's probably hard to imagine how nation-based the debates in Norway are, and the cultural life too, which has good and bad sides. I'm not judging here and now, but it's really opening the horizon to switch into another public sphere.
I think I would like to add something. Yes, insular, maybe a little bit unfair, but I would say that it is very Anglo-American in its international orientation. That's something that's very nice about Vagant, and also for our project being actually in Germany and in Europe, and basically channeling a lot of the cultural and intellectual impulses from the continent.
We have for several years had a very conscious translation policy, not to translate anything from English, and as far as possible not cover any any literature from the Anglosphere. But we sort of had to step a bit back and think it's a bit artificial, because then it won't be a real reflection of the literary and intellectual life of contemporary times if you leave out the main global literature. But we are having this continuous discussion about it. It's not because we want to be chauvinistic or anti-American or anything. It's not resentment-based, but it's more to try to show that there are other entrances to different subjects and different discussions, different traditions, which I think is really, really important.
I also always thought that the availability of English-speaking literature and culture and movies in Scandinavia was a lot better than in Germany. I mean, if you go to a Norwegian or Swedish bookshop, you have a very big English section, because that is not everything is dubbed. You can actually watch a movie in its with subtitles, and I think that's one difference to a German in the cultural life, even though the feuilleton is, of course, an international milieu. Yeah.
I think Norwegians are basically bilingual now, right? I mean, they grow up with English being so much part of their daily life, and of course that also shapes our broader outlook and our understanding of the world and our understanding of what is important or what is zeitgeisty is very much influenced by America, I would say. And also for that reason, I think it is very good that we have this, modest counterweight that is Vagant and House of Foundation and projects like ours.
And I think we're also aware that we're pretty isolated up in the north, and that we're small countries in comparison, and that our languages aren't international languages, and that also influences our relationship to the English language, and it's a bridge for us out into the world from the isolation up in the north.
That might be something new, because if I'm thinking of the Norwegian author Dag Solstad, who lived in Berlin in the early 2000s, and he said, I don't want to speak German. I don't want to learn German. I want to be here and think Norwegian and not having to do anything with German or English languages. And he was it's in his book, which is somehow a novel about Berlin, but also some sort of tourist guide for people who don't want to be tourists. He sounded very happy, not to just strolling around like a sleepwalker. That's what he writes actually.
He's very much in the Thomas Bernhard camp.
Yeah.
So this language question is quite fascinating, I think, because you give the good sides of being in other language areas, making you able to shut off or to listen in another way. But you are publishing Norwegian in Berlin, and you have your readers and your editors all around in Europe, and you are publishing in Norwegian. I think it's magnificent that these smaller languages still are being published. And you are publishing in Swedish, I think, Pralin, in Berlin.
All Scandinavian languages and English,
Yes.
yeah.
And is there no conflict in being in a German language area and publishing then your books in different languages? I can see the good sides, but I'm to think and to make your meaning totally clear. You often need your mother tongue. Don't you have that experience?
Yeah.
There are so many of us here, you know.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
There are so many of us, Norwegian, Scandinavian.
And so you
writers.
can have your mother tongue.
We can't find the people to communicate with.
Yeah.
We've been discussing ways to give something back to the German context. We applied for money to make an anthology with Vagant texts in German, and we have translated a few texts into German on our website. And if we just had the time and the money, we definitely would have made a sort of two-language edition. Apart from that, of course, we are somehow a bit estranged from the environment. There's no reason to hide that. And there are good and bad sides to that. Dag Solstad definitely enjoyed being estranged. He's written about estrangement his whole life. But it's a different experience than to, if you were, it's a different experience to be a Wahlberliner than to be born here. But that also goes for Germans.
Absolutely. Germans from outside Berlin moving to Berlin can also be strange. And
It's part of the attraction, isn't it? I mean, I met a lot of Germans who have moved to Berlin because they want to be estranged, basically, or they want to experience a kind of positive alienation that Berlin offers.
And it is an alienation, and it has, I think, something to do with the belatedness, because when you come to Berlin, you're always too late. Everything has already happened. The good times are always behind you, but you can still live in this illusion of, but I'm still here. It's still better than living in Passau and Regensburg and Heidelberg. This is somehow the double bind of this. I hope nobody from these places is here. The double bind of the Berlin promise. But the danger of living here is also forgetting the time. And since I'm the moderator, I have to have another look. And we should now get our featured poet into our round, which is Ghayath Almadhoun. He's a writer, poet, whose work has been translated into, I think, 15 languages and also into German. 2018, the publishing house Arche has published a collection of his poetry under the title Ein Raubtier namens Mittelmeer. Almadhoun has worked with other writers and artists, including Jenny Holzer and another Berlin Urgestein called Blixer Bargeld. He's the son of Palestinian immigrants and grew up in Damascus, but emigrated to Stockholm in 2008, and since then is moving back and forth between Berlin and Stockholm. And he will read one of his poems now, and Carla Mangold will then also come on stage and read the English translation, I think. Welcome on stage.
So, good afternoon. So we decided in the end to read the English translation instead of the German. I would like to thank Carla because she will read the translation, and Mats for the invitation, and Martin, I hope he's good now. I didn't have the chance to meet him. So this text, I wrote it when I was in Amsterdam. 3 years ago I was there, and the government decided the war in Syria stopped, finished. I went to the office, and all my colleagues, they told me, congratulations. I told them, for what? They told me that the war ended in Syria. And I say, who said that? They say the government. I told them, but I called my mother like 1 hour ago. She didn't mention. Anyway. I will read only 1.5 minutes maybe in Arabic because there is no Arabic audience, and Carla will read the English. Sadly, I don't have any copy outside from the German book. It's so easy to find it on the internet. I have the English, Arabic, and the Italian. لو كنا في عالم افتراضي ومع أن النافذة افتراضية فإن القتلى حقيقيون. خالد سليمان الناصري. 1. انتهت الحرب. لقد انتهت الحرب، لكن القنابل لا زالت تتساقط داخل رأسي. لو كنا في عالم افتراضي لكنت مسحت زجاج النافذة المطلة على بيتك بجريدة إلكترونية، ولنمت الوردة البلاستيكية التي وضعتها على قبر أخي. انتهت الحرب، والأصدقاء الذين ذهبوا إلى السوق كي يشتروا موتا طازجا قتلوا في الطريق. لو كنا في عالم افتراضي لكنت أعدت تدوير أصدقائي، فأنا بحاجة لأصدقاء مستعملين. انتهت الحرب، وعاد القتلى إلى أهلهم سالمين. عاد الشهداء إلى أمهاتهم كاملين. عادت الأمهات إلى البيوت. عادت البيوت، الشوارع، الجوامع، الأعين، الأقدام، الأشلاء إلى أصحابها. عادت الأصابع إلى الأيادي، الخواتم إلى الأصابع، المدارس إلى الأطفال. عادت حبال الغسيل إلى الشرفات، العشاق إلى الأساطيح، أخي إلى أمي، وأنا عدت إلى الشام. لو كنا في عالم افتراضي لنسيت أن أتذكر الحرب، ولتذكرت أن أنساها، كما ينسى القتلى ملامح الجنرال، وكما يتذكر الشهداء الطريق إلى البيت. انتهت الحرب، وأصبح جميع من عرفتهم ميتين، أو مجرمي حرب ميتين. لو كنا في عالم افتراضي لأطفأت الحرب كما تطفئين التلفزيون، ولكننا ولدنا في عالم ابن عاهرة، وحين يولد الناس في عالم ابن عاهرة يتحول الزمن إلى آلة كاتبة، والقتلى إلى قصائد. هامش كوميدي. تكمن عبقرية دانتي في الليمبو، تأملها قليلاً وستدرك فوراً أننا نعيش في أولى طبقات الجحيم. قطع. كارلا. Can I stand?
Of course, you can stand beside me. I'm Carla, and I want to thank Ghayath for trusting me with his lovely poem. If we were in a virtual world, Ghayath Almadhoun. Even though the window is virtual, the dead are real. Khaled Suleiman al-Nasiri. 1. The war is over. The war is over, but the bombs are still falling inside my head. If we were in a virtual world, I would have cleaned the window overlooking your house with an electronic newspaper, and the plastic rose that I put on my brother's grave would have grown. The war is over, and the friends who went to the market to buy a fresh death were killed on the way. If we were in a virtual world, I would have recycled my friends, for I need second-hand friends. The war is over, and the dead have returned to their families safe and sound. The martyrs have returned to their mothers in one piece. Mothers have returned to their houses, streets, mosques, eyes. Legs have returned to their owners. Fingers have returned to hands. Rings to fingers, schools to children, washing lines to balconies, lovers to rooftops. My brother has returned to my mother, and I have returned to Damascus. If we were in a virtual world, I would have forgotten to remember the war, and remembered to forget it, as the dead forgot the general's features, and the mortars remember the way home. The war is over, and all those I knew are dead, or war criminals, or dead war criminals. If we were in a virtual world, I would have turned off the war like you turn off the television, but we were born into a bitch of a world, and when people are born into a bitch of a world, time changes into a typewriter, and the dead become poems. Comedy footnote. The genius of Dante lies in his description of limbo. Think about it a little. You realize immediately that we're living in the first circle of hell. 2. War. I tried to translate the war from a Semitic language to an Indo-European language for you, and you were hit by shrapnel. I tried to come to your aid, and we were besieged by news bulletins. The Security Council tried to send us smart weapons, and security men of average intelligence confiscated them. We insulted the Red Cross, and the Vatican objected. We ate the flesh of dogs whose owners had been killed, and the environmentalists objected. We were saved from drowning, and the European right objected. How can I describe to you how much this world resembles the beating of skinny hands on the thick walls of gas chambers in detention camps without giving you PTSD? How can I explain the difference between house slaves and field slaves without making you confuse Syria with surrealism? How can I say in the same poem, my friends were tortured to death, and you are more beautiful than New York, without Lorca laughing in his grave, or poetry being separated from reality? Tragedy footnote. The problem with this world is not that a quarter of its inhabitants go to psychiatric clinics. The problem is that the rest don't go. 3. Chess. When the wind passed by, it couldn't find the tree, and the axe was looking at me, while I was lost in translation, calm as a ceasefire, stuck in a blue planet in a remote suburb of the Milky Way. I saw a gazelle devouring a wolf, blood dripping from her teeth. I saw barren women suckling fetuses that were born dead. I saw electronic flies emerging from Twitter and hovering over my friends' corpses. I saw a country traveling in a fishing boat, and a man eating his dead brother's flesh, not metaphorically as in the Quran, but eating the flesh of his brother killed in a bombing raid, so as not to starve to death. The wind passed and didn't find the tree or the city or the country. The dogs didn't howl. The caravan didn't move on. My wife, the widow, looks at me, and the war is clean like a game of chess. Barrels of oil rise in price, and barrel bombs of TNT fall on cities. Planes lick school textbooks and suck children's fingers, while I am silent like a European citizen who enjoys the privileges of the first world and asks with innocence of a domesticated wolf, which is harsher. The Swedish winter or the Arab spring. Absurd footnote. The New York Times says milk is white. Paul Celan says milk is black. My mother says there is no milk. 4. A metaphor from a virtual world. Dante was right. This comedy that we are explaining is divine. this comedy that we are living is divine, or to be fair, let's say that it's at least 97% divine. Otherwise, how do you explain the fact that everything around us resembles a metaphor from a virtual world? Flowers have sex via bees. Adolf Hitler was vegetarian. We are happy because the USA hasn't dropped the atomic bomb on Tokyo. A dictator's supporters demonstrate to demand the banning of demonstrations. I love you. God sells lands full of milk and honey. Finland is the happiest country in the world, according to the World Happiness Report. The cross you wear around your neck is no more than a Roman instrument of torture. Tragicomedy footnote. Since everybody is going to die in the end, the death rate in Syria and Sweden is the same.
Thank you.
I also think it's important to note the translator. Yeah.
Catherine Copeland.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ghayath, and thanks, Carla. And I think time-wise, we're doing good. Are there questions? Are we allowed to take questions from the audience? Is that something that is still possible? If there are no questions from the audience, we can continue the discussion outside and with the coffee. There's a half an hour break now, and after this break at 3, there's the next panel with the title Berlin liegt im Süden. Well, Sehnsuchtsort vor und nach 1989. I hope you can all stay, and I want to thank again the panel and Janke, Klok, Audun, Eirik, and me for this nice discussion and for this opening of hopefully a nice day. It's beautiful out there. Wannsee liegt am Süden. Tusen Takk.